Jung's most profound insight wasn't merely about mental health. It concerned individuals with an extraordinary capacity to notice what others overlook, and the challenging impact this ability had on their lives. In his clinical observations, Jung identified patients exhibiting what he termed differentiated perception. These individuals possessed an acute awareness, capable of interpreting subtle, nonverbal cues, sensing concealed emotions, and discerning intricate psychological patterns that remained hidden from most. They could effortlessly pierce through social facades, immediately detect falsehoods, and perceive the unspoken tensions within any given environment. Jung deemed this revelation perilous because such individuals frequently found themselves isolated, emotionally drained, and struggling to maintain conventional relationships. This wasn't due to instability, but because their heightened perception carried a psychological toll that few comprehended. Today, I will explore Jung's most critical finding regarding those who perceive everything and why he believed this unique aptitude either leads to profound distress or transforms one into an exceptionally remarkable being. The pivotal case that illuminated Jung's most significant discovery began with a patient he detailed in his personal notes, a deeply introverted, intuitive personality type who sought his help in 1913 during Jung's own period of psychological turmoil following his separation from Freud. This patient, embodying what Jung would later classify as the rarest personality profile, possessed what he referred to as undifferentiated intuitive perception.
She could enter any setting and instantly grasp its psychological atmosphere. Who was being dishonest, who was experiencing emotional pain, and who harbored secret resentments. Jung recorded, "The patient exhibits an exceptional faculty for discerning unconscious content in others, yet this ability appears to cause her considerable suffering rather than advantage. She found casual conversations impossible as she saw beyond every social pretense. Sustaining friendships was difficult because people felt exposed and uneasy in her presence. She struggled to hold employment because her very presence disrupted the unspoken collective agreements that enable groups to function harmoniously." Jung realized he wasn't treating a pathology, he was observing the consequences when the unconscious becomes overly conscious, when perception becomes too refined for social adaptability. He documented her uncanny accuracy in describing people. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motives. When I corroborate her observations through careful inquiry, they prove remarkably precise. This was neither psychosis nor delusion. It was a form of consciousness so advanced it became socially problematic. Yet Jung uncovered something even more unsettling, as this patient's extraordinary perception seemed inexplicable. Consequently, Jung began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly refined intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious material emanating from others. Jung noted in his Red Book-era writings, "Among us are those whose psychic apparatus is so exquisitely attuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their surroundings." Contemporary research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons corroborates Jung's early observations. Her studies indicate that approximately 20% of the population possesses heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. However, Jung identified a more specific characteristic within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who not only experience emotions deeply, but also perceive unconscious patterns with astonishing clarity.
Jung observed that these individuals possess what he called a differentiated intuitive function.
Their minds process not just overt social cues, but also unconscious emotional states, suppressed content, and psychological patterns that others fail to detect. They discern the despair hidden behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident exteriors. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously choose to ignore. Jung wrote, "The peril lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it engenders. When one clearly sees what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society finds unbearable to gaze into." This leads to what Jung labeled the problem of the superior function, where one's greatest strength transforms into one's greatest burden, because it severs one from collective unconscious engagement. However, Jung discovered that the true danger wasn't the perception itself, because individuals with highly differentiated perception clearly see the unconscious content of others. Therefore, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting aspects they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "Nothing has a stronger psychological influence on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent."
But he realized this principle extended to all relationships. When an individual's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two options: integrate the shadow or attack the reflection. Jung repeatedly documented this pattern in his clinical work. The person who perceives clearly is blamed for creating the problems they are merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition constantly experience this. When they would gently suggest that someone appeared troubled, that person would lash out, accusing them of being negative or creating drama. When they expressed concern about obvious issues, they were accused of being judgmental or fabricating problems where none existed. Jung recognized this wasn't coincidence, it was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's simpler to assault the individual reflecting their shadow than to examine what is being reflected." This creates what Jung termed the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem within every group they join, not because they cause issues, but because they reveal existing problems within the collective unconscious. Jung observed, "The possessor of superior perception becomes the receptacle for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself." This pattern explains why these individuals not only feel misunderstood, but also systematically targeted by a force they cannot rationally explain. However, Jung's most unsettling discovery was yet to come, as he noticed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in various individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a unique way of processing unconscious content from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with a differentiated feeling function. These individuals don't just intellectually grasp psychological dynamics, they physically experience them within themselves. They absorb the emotions of others so completely that they often struggle to differentiate between their own feelings and those they have unconsciously internalized. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment." Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals perceive psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with striking accuracy.
Jung observed they could foresee relationship breakdowns, career failures, and personal crises months before they materialized, not through logical deduction, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted, "They possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see." Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote, "These individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical ailments in their environment." Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called an undifferentiated auxiliary function. They perceived everything, but struggled to organize or articulate their perceptions coherently. Jung observed, they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding your specific pattern is critical, because each type necessitates different approaches to what Jung termed the integration challenge.
But first, you need to comprehend why Jung considered this discovery so hazardous. Because Jung observed the devastating impact of undifferentiated perception on his patients. Therefore, he concluded that perceiving everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine threats to both individual and collective well-being. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so menacing. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends." When someone sees through the shared illusions that bind groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by authentically existing. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of superior function, when your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. He wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it." The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation is not merely social, it is existential. These individuals often report feeling as if they are living in a different reality from everyone around them. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. Most perilously, Jung discovered that people who absorb unconscious content from others often lose touch with their own authentic personality. They become so inundated with external psychological material that they cannot distinguish between their own inner world and what they are absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual merges with collective unconscious content. He wrote, "The danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession." This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, therefore Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while cultivating a conscious relationship with unconscious content. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that was not their own. He termed this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote, "The first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development." Technique. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who clearly see the shadows of others often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you will be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward." Shadow integration means acknowledging that you embody every human quality you observe in others. This does not make you a bad person, it makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with the psychological content of others without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote, "The individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity." This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to temporarily hold the unconscious content of others while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals. Therefore, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown.
The case of Nietzsche, unintegrated perception. Jung was profoundly influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy, but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about Nietzsche's capacity to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of utilizing his perception for healing, he wielded it as a weapon against society. Jung wrote, "Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality." Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what occurs when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they perceive rather than transformed by it. The case of Meister Eckhart, successful integration. Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom he considered an exemplar of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. Jung wrote, "Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance." Jung noted that Eckhart's success stemmed from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be brandished.
Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book. Jung wrote, "I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients." His superior perception of unconscious content, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him until he learned to consciously integrate these experiences. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. This realization transformed his approach to patients with similar gifts.
because individuals with superior perception often face isolation. Therefore, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1. Fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote, "The individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them." Type 2. Those engaged in individuation. Jung observed that people actively pursuing their own individuation process through therapy, inner work, or spiritual practice can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they comprehend its value. Jung wrote, "Those who had begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others." Type 3. Natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called a natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have navigated significant life challenges. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, an interest in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol. Jung taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. 1. Begin with small, gentle observations. 2. Notice their response pattern to feedback. 3. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. 4. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. 5. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image.
Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development. Therefore, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, people who help consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation. Stage 1. Recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. Jung wrote, "The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be." Stage 2. Integration without isolation. The second stage involves learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. Jung observed, "The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but engages with it more consciously." Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer rather than a burden you carry. Jung called this conscious participation. using your abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole." Stage 4. Legacy without attachment.
The final stage involves what Jung called transcendent function, using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. Jung observed, "The individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. The integration becomes cultural medicine." Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They perceive what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious content conscious before it manifests destructively in collective behavior. But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail this transformation, because the path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers. Therefore, Jung documented the most common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. Jung wrote extensively about psychological inflation, when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he warned, "The danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships." Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Jung called the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Jung observed, "The moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand." Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. Jung documented cases where individuals used their superior perception to rationalize complete withdrawal from society. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to be worth engaging, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wisdom. Jung wrote, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it." Pitfall 3. The helper's haze. Jung observed that some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Jung warned, "When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role." Pitfall 4. The overwhelmed return. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during periods of stress, trauma, or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded with others' unconscious content again. Jung emphasized, integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention.
The integration maintenance. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological content from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious content. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Jung wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." Because Jung understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development, therefore he viewed highly perceptive individuals as serving an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society." He believed that people with superior perception serve as what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. The historical pattern. Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their insights. They served as advanced scouts for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. Jung wrote, "What appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole." Modern manifestations. Jung believed that in the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns that explain collective behavior, environmental and social unsustainability before it becomes obvious, spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, technological implications that others haven't considered, collective shadow content that needs conscious integration. Jung's insight. The sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. The service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung wrote, "The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole." The ultimate integration.
At the highest level of development, Jung observed, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others' acceptance of what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who came to him during his own psychological crisis? After 3 years of working with Jung's individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological content and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor where her differentiated perception helped troubled individuals. She built relationships with people who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious development. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most dangerous discovery, that some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers, preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see everything. It's that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in failing to develop a conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires, once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, and Jung's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.